In 1939, Bernard works as a shoeshine boy outside a bank, and the boy listens to his white customers' conversations about finance and real estate investment. One day while he is listening to a bank meeting, a policeman sees him and starts chasing him, yelling that his father will learn that he is spying on white people. That night Bernard's father talks to his son, telling him stories of how young black men could be hanged for anything when he himself was young. Seeing Bernard's finance notebook, he says he is a smart boy, but that no white man will let him make money in this world. Bernard, however, insists that one day he will be rich. In 1954 in Los Angeles, Bernard arrives by car with his wife Eunice and son Bernard Jr. to visit his wife's uncle. The uncle tells Bernard that the Northrop Aircraft Company is hiring black men and that he can get a job there, but Bernard refuses, saying that he will try real estate. His idea is to own property and rent it out. His uncle laughs, saying that he won't be able to do it. Until they can afford a house of their own, the three rent a shed in Eunice's uncle's backyard, and Bernard promises his wife that he will buy a real house as soon as possible. The next day, as he drives cousin Tony to work, Tony apologizes for his father's words. A white boy named Matt, Tony's friend, is fascinated that Bernard owns a car, thinking he is rich. He asks Tony what Bernard does for a living, to which Tony replies that Bernard owns buildings. Next, Bernard inspects several properties and calls the owners to hear their asking prices. A few days later, Bernard shows his wife a property in a white neighborhood that they can afford, but they won't have any more money to fix it up. His wife has an idea and she takes him to a potential co-investor named Joe, for whom she worked before she married. Bernard thinks Joe was acting too relaxed, not serious and like a playboy. So he leaves without sharing his business idea, telling his wife that he does not intend to cooperate with Joe. The wife is not happy because she thinks he has the wrong idea about Joe and she wants Bernard to come in and talk again. Suddenly they see the governor arrive, who apparently is Joe's friend, but Bernard still does not want to cooperate with him. Later Bernard meets with the owner of the property he can afford, and he asks Patrick to lend him $10,000 for renovations if he buys the building. Patrick replies that he does not do business this way. However, his calculations are slightly off and Bernard quickly corrects him, which impresses Patrick, as few people have such expertise. Unfortunately, he still refuses to give him a loan. Bernard notices a gift on a shelf behind Patrick's back, which Patrick received from his banker, a man named Mr. Reed who works at Mid-City Bank. Later, he goes to Mid-City Bank to talk to the banker. However, Mr. Reed is not available to meet with him and Bernard waits for him outside the bank. Bernard shows up explaining that he has a business idea from which both he and Patrick could benefit. Afterwards Bernard returns to the cabin telling his wife that he was unable to convince Mr. Reed. Suddenly Bernard receives a phone call. It is Patrick, who has heard that Bernard has gone to his banker. He asks Bernard if he thinks what he has done follows normal business customs, and Bernard replies, somewhat hesitantly, that he does not think so. Suddenly, Patrick changes his tone of voice, sounding happy, and he says he will do the deal because he likes people who do not follow normal business customs, just like Bernard. The next day, when Bernard and his wife are at a club celebrating, Joe suddenly approaches, wanting to talk to Bernard. The next day, Bernard and Tony start renovating the property Bernard bought. A woman who lives there sees them and she tells them that they cannot stay there, but Bernard replies that he owns the building. Upset, the woman comments that he is impertinent and that this is a building for white people. Later, Matt arrives to help renovate and Bernard asks him if he is okay with working for him, to which Matt replies that he has always worked for other men. Bernard clarifies his question, asking if he is okay working for a black man, to which Matt replies that the only color he cares about is that his money is green. Renovations begin, but shortly thereafter two officers arrive and tell Bernard that a lady in the building called and said he was posing as the owner. Bernard shows documents stating that this is his property, and the two policemen leave saying that he should be more respectful to his tenants. When the elderly woman learns that Bernard and his family are also moving in as tenants, she leaves because she cannot stand the presence of black people. Within days other somewhat wealthier black families move in, and before long the property is completely rented out. Patrick sees Bernard's success and talent in real estate, so he proposes a 50-50 partnership to buy more properties. Bernard thinks this will allow him to expand more quickly, since Patrick can be the front of the company, so he gladly accepts. The two of them work and buy more and more beautiful properties, getting help from Matt, Tony, and Bernard's wife with renovations and decorating. One day Bernard takes his wife to a large mansion, asking her what kind of furniture she needs, but he quickly surprises her by telling her that this is their new home. A few months later, Patrick is found dead in his bed one morning. Sometime later during a negotiation, Patrick's wife offers Bernard 25% of all the buildings he and Patrick bought together, but since his name does not appear on any documents, his only two options are to accept the 25% or get nothing. Bernard goes to talk to Mr. Reed to see if there is a chance to help him, but Mr. Reed does not want to meet with him. Suddenly Bernard gets an idea seeing all the financial institutions renting space in the big banker's building he is in. He goes to talk to Joe, who he has learned owns 18 rental properties, and he suggests they start a joint venture. If they partner, they could potentially buy the banker's building. That way the 12 banks that rent space there will have to think twice before refusing them loans in the future. They can start buying more properties in white-only neighborhoods and expand more rapidly. Joe laughs and thinks this is very bold, but he wonders how anyone would want to sell their properties to them since they are black. A little later they invite Matt by asking him to be the front of their business venture, since he is white. Matt says he knows nothing about business and is dubious, although the two offer to teach him all they can. Later at a diner, a waitress named Susie finds the courage to approach Matt, whom she is interested in. She tells him that he is a few years younger, but that she has known him since high school. She asks him what he is thinking and he tells her that it is about a new job. Matt explains to her that it is some kind of partnership in real estate investment and she is impressed. Matt returns to meet with Bernard and Joe, saying that he will gladly take the job. Joe tells him to report to the golf course at 6 a.m. the next morning. To make a good impression on the bank owner, Matt must learn to play golf, and Joe teaches him. At the same time, Bernard meets Joe's old trusted banker, Donald, who is willing to lend them a maximum of $2 million to purchase the bank property. Bernard tells Donald not to worry, as he intends to obtain the property for a lower amount. Subsequently, Bernard teaches Matt about real estate calculations. Over the course of several weeks, Matt slowly improves in golf and math. Soon Matt learns table etiquette, and he procures a suitable suit. One day, Matt performs calculations in his head while playing golf like a pro, and the two decide he is ready. They review the banker's building deal together, and Bernard says they arranged for Matt to run into the owner, Charles Renault, at an exclusive golf club. As expected, Matt succeeds in impressing him with his golf skills. The two set up a meeting to negotiate the price of the banker's building and potentially close a deal. A week later Matt goes to the meeting and goes over the math course in his head. The meeting goes smoothly, and Matt impresses Charles once again with his knowledge of the real estate market and his quick calculations in his head. Eventually they settle on $1,560,000. They celebrate the purchase, and after that they are seen forming good relationships with bankers. They buy more and more valuable, larger and larger properties in whites-only neighborhoods, and Matt marries Susie. The trio becomes real estate moguls and they end up meeting the Vice President of the United States who has moved to the banker's building. A few years later, the two visit Bernard's father in Willis, Texas, and the father expresses all his pride to him. Bernard and his son Bernard Jr. are out for a walk the next day when Bernard sees the Mainland Bank, outside of which many years earlier he shined the shoes of rich men. Back in Los Angeles, Bernard tells Joe that he wants to buy the bank in Texas. Joe says that running a bank is very complex and out of their expertise, partly because it is located in Texas, where people are even more opposed to black people running businesses. However, Bernard is convinced that they can buy it like they did with the banker's building, having Matt as a front. When Joe learns that there is a large untapped market, since blacks cannot borrow from the bank, he agrees to become a partner. Sometime later, with the help of Donald, Matt manages to buy Mainland Bank for Bernard and Joe, while the previous owner and his son Florence still hold 20% of the bank. The two immediately begin making discreet loans to responsible black people, doubling the loans accepted. Thanks to this, some black families can afford nicer homes and some black businessmen can increase the income from their businesses. 3 months pass like this, but suddenly the son of the previous owner, Florence, who is an executive at the bank, he discovers that they are giving loans to blacks. One day he confronts them saying that if people find out that they are giving loans to blacks, there might be an escape from the bank. They ask him how he can find out, and Florence shows a document indicating that the U.S. Treasury Department will conduct an inspection within a month after receiving anonymous reports that the bank is making too many unsafe loans. Later, Matt shares with Joe and Bernard an idea to resolve the situation. He explains that they can buy another small bank that he himself can manage, and then they can do some financial tricks to divide the loans they made between the two banks. This way, there is much less risk of the government closing the bank for making too many loans. Joe and Bernard think this is a bad idea since Matt has only 3 months of banking experience. Matt says he is very grateful for everything they have taught him, but that he will stop helping them unless he has the opportunity to become a partner and owner as well. Finding themselves apparently in a difficult situation, Joe and Bernard agree. Matt purchases and becomes the owner of their newly acquired bank, called Marlin Bank. They thus begin to set things up to reduce risk. About a day later, Florence calls Matt saying that some white people want to withdraw all their money from Mainland Bank, thinking that the bank is owned by blacks. Bernard and Joe later learn that 5 whites have withdrawn all their money and 9 have been persuaded by Florence to stay. One morning, a federal bank inspector shows up at Marlin Bank, telling Matt that he will return within the hour to examine the ledgers. Matt immediately calls Bernard and explains the situation to him. Bernard tells his wife that Matt is in trouble and that he himself will have to attend the meeting with the inspector to prevent Matt from making trouble. Eunice suggests that he dress up as a cleaning lady to help Matt from outside the meeting room, but he says he will not do it, and Eunice comments that she has done it many times to help their business. Bernard says that she is a woman, which is different. She gets angry, saying that she is not acting much better than racist whites if he is going to differentiate between men and women. Persuaded by his wife's words, Bernard is seen cleaning up as Matt and the inspector meet. Bernard starts to help Matt, but the inspector closes the door because they are talking about confidential information. Bernard can no longer hear or help Matt and he leaves. Matt starts to get into trouble and he goes to check some files, going to Joe, Bernard and Eunice for help. They give him some advice, but the inspector finds several bad loans in their books. Later, the trio argues and Joe and Bernard will have to put up $300,000 of their own money to cover the bank's bad loans. Matt feels guilty for causing Joe and Bernard to lose $300,000. A few days later, Joe receives a phone call from his lawyer Donald, who informs him that Mainland Bank has purchased $300,000 in bad loans from Marlin Bank. Joe is shocked by the news and together with Bernard quickly goes to Mainland Bank and angrily asks Matt what he is doing, since the purchase of bad debts is a fraud. Matt says he thought he could fix things temporarily, and Bernard asks him to bring the books immediately to make things right. But at that same moment some feds arrive announcing that the Treasury Department has revoked Mainland's banking license. They fire Matt, tell the people inside the bank that it is closed until further notice. As soon as they leave, the FBI arrests Joe and Bernard. Sometime later, in Washington, D.C., a lawyer tells Joe and Bernard that the state banking charges against them have been dropped, but that the federal charges are still in effect. He mentions that, as it happens, an Arkansas senator is holding hearings on an issue called lax rules in banking, which relates to Joe and Bernard's charges. If they succeed in making their case, they could make the issue political, thus forcing the federal charges to be dropped as well. At the same time, Matt is in trouble for fraudulently handling the situation with the bank, and he is told that he can either agree to go to jail or explain in court that it was all Joe and Bernard's fault and he will be free. Later at home, Matt thinks it over and makes a phone call to someone. The next day, Matt testifies in court that Joe and Bernard hired, manipulated, and coached him on how to handle loans and money transfers. After the testimony, Bernard has 2 options. Either accept the immunity agreement and confirm what Matt said, that he took advantage of lax rules to enrich himself, which would allow Congress to correct those rules and he would be a free man. Or he can refuse and say whatever he wants, and his statement will be compared with the testimony of many white people, and if the court decides he is lying, he will go to jail. Later, Bernard takes a walk outside with Eunice and she observes how beautiful the buildings are. Bernard says it was probably too soon for two black people to own banks, but his wife tells him that maybe it was just the right time, because it sheds light on racial issues. Bernard says that if he mentions in his testimony the problem that many blacks are still excluded from the American dream, he could lose the immunity deal. He asks Eunice what he should do, and she tells him that whatever he decides to do, she will stand by him and support him. Just before he goes in to testify, Bernard talks to Joe, and the two of them think back on the years they have worked together, up to this point. They share some jokes and friendly comments, after which Bernard enters the courtroom. In testimony, Bernard states that the nation's founding documents declare that all men are created equal, a lofty goal that is yet to be achieved. While he is constantly warned that he will lose his immunity, Bernard stands up and goes on to say that if a man cannot get a loan, he cannot start a business and cannot build wealth or buy a home, and as such he is excluded from the American dream. Finally, he asks a rhetorical question: how can so many blacks be excluded from the American dream? Joe and Bernard were sentenced to 3 years in prison, and the federal government seized all their assets, including all the buildings they owned and their personal property. In the final scenes, Bernard is seen leaving prison, greeted by Joe and his wife. He tells Eunice that they should go home, and she is confused, saying that they have none. Bernard then reveals a secret. The day before Matt's testimony, Matt called him and told him that he was facing 50 years in prison if he did not blame Joe and himself for everything. He told Matt to do what he had to do, but since the government had not yet taken their assets, he asked Matt for a favor, to buy 2 houses for him and Joe in the Bahamas. Hearing this, Eunice is overjoyed. 3 years after their testimonies, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, finally ending these racial problems in buying and renting property. What do you think about racism? Write it in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Thanks for watching.